jobs. And that's my main thing, is because our kids want money. Like, they want to start businesses, they are entrepreneurs, they are creative.
Scared to even approach an officer. If I get pulled over
to the community, where we're not connecting with people just during times of trauma or times of police enforcement action, but being able to connect with people one-on-one.
And sadly, our systems are badly broken. Unfortunately, far too many young people don't get what they need while they're in those environments. And so we have to do better than just simply housing young people in custody.
Put your hands back and see them, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over? And why would you pull over another one saying, keep going, sir? How are you doing?
So without further ado, we're going to go to the panelists. And so we're going to have Alan A. Nancy, ma'am, sorry. You're going to have a seat. Choose a seat here, wherever you like. And my name is Tyrus. I'm going to be the moderator, all right? All right, you can have a seat right there next to Jesse. Yeah, right there in the middle. Alrighty, alrighty. So why are we here today? Can I get someone to tell me why we here today? You got food in your mouth? Okay, how about you? Why are we here today? Nah, I don't see anything. I don't see anything. I don't see anything.
To improve in our community.
Why are they here today?
To show love.
Okay, show love. Alright, so we're here to address the youth incarceration rate here in Washington State. And so we have these guys up here because they're the experts in this situation, right? And so we want to ask them some questions so we can have an honest conversation, right? So this is going to be a conversation. There are going to be questions. So first, let's be nice to them, okay? Can we promise to be nice to them? All right, but hey, once in a while you can give up a little, once in a while. So I'm going to give them each a mic to formally introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there. Sounds good? All right. Start with you, Alan.
Thank you, Tyrus, very much. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to be here. I want to really acknowledge Aydepi and Out of the Box for their commitment to community and for partnership with not only our agencies, but with the young people. So thank you so much. My name is Alan Nance. I'm the Juvenile Division Director for the Children and Family Justice Center at the Juvenile Detention Facility.
My name is State Representative Jesse Johnson. I also want to salute both organizations for your visionary leadership, doing amazing community empowerment work. I'm from Federal Way. I went to Federal Way High School, graduated back in 2009. 253, stand up. And outside of that, I'm an educator, former city council member here in the city of Federal Way, and current state representative.
My name is Michael Coffey. I'm a lieutenant with the Federal Way Police Department. I've been with the city for about 15 years. Worked in patrol and is a detective working primarily child abuse and domestic violence crimes. So I also have engaged with the youth in the community with regards to my involvement in investigations, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and be part of this discussion to try to establish some connections with the community and really create a better environment for all of the citizens of Federal Way and the youth that we have in King County. So thank you again.
We have the youth representatives up here, right? So I'm gonna have you guys introduce yourselves.
As you all know, my name is Fiona Oketch, and I am the Youth Director of Aydepi. And yeah, thank you.
I got you, Justin. All right. I think I forgot to say my name earlier. My name is Justin Jaguna, and I'm from Out of the Box. All right, sounds good, sounds good. So let's go ahead and get started with the questions. You guys ready?
Ready.
You guys ready? Okay. So, I'm gonna start with Representative Jesse Johnson. First of all, I wanna say that you inspire me I mean, you're a young guy, you went from city council to now you're a state representative, and hopefully one day you're gonna be the president of the United States of America, right? Right? Yeah? Why not? So I'm gonna start with you. So in order to help our community grow, what resources do you feel like are out there for us to grow, that can help us grow?
Well, I'm going to start by saying there's definitely not enough resources out there, and that's why I'm here. That's one of the reasons I decided to go into public service, was I didn't see representation. I didn't see folks that looked like me in power. I always say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and I saw a lot of that happening within local government, state government, federal government, and so on. And so I'm here to create access and opportunity. And anyone that wants to talk with me throughout the rest of today or beyond, feel free, and I'll provide my contact information. But I will say this, this year, one of the first priorities of what's called our caucus at the state legislature, which is our leadership, is racial justice. And when we talk about racial justice, a lot of times, you know, we think of correcting past mistakes, creating policies that try to dismantle what we call a destructive system. And I think, you know, for me, racial justice is creating conditions for our young people, for our communities of color, and for everyone to thrive. And right now, we have a number of things going on within the city of Federal Way. I'm happy to say my alma mater, Federal Way High School, will be hosting or having our first ever pre-apprenticeship trade school program this fall. And so if you're interested in going into construction trades, painting, general contracting, electrical, maritime, all of that stuff, we're starting at Federal Way High School with 50 students. We have about 25, I think, already registered. But I was happy to launch that because I think it's important that our kids that don't want to go the college route or the military route have an opportunity to earn money right out of high school and get their certification. So it's sort of like running start for the trades. You get a dual high school credit and graduation, and then you'll get a certification in either one of those general contracting trades. So that's at Federal Way High School. We also got some funding for Open Doors Academy at Truman. So a lot of our young folks that are coming out of the juvenile carceral system that need support with reentry work, a lot of the work Out of the Box does, we want to provide an opportunity to get jobs right away. So we have funding for them to get access to, you know, going up to Boeing, going to Microsoft and Google, getting out of the community and going out to opportunity. And so we have some funding this fall to start that with field trips. And then I think a lot of the issues that we see are because, you know, a couple things. We haven't been funded, and so I know a lot of the work at the county through Best Starts for Kids, they're trying to create funding and those opportunities, but a lot of our funding is levy funding, and so it's not going to be sustainable unless we partner amongst different organizations. It has to be state, city, county, all coming together and creating those public-private partnerships to create more sustainable funding. Because the worst thing we can do is set up our organizations with funding for a limited time, and then it's not sustainable, and it's tough to have the capacity to keep going. And so I'm working on a capacity building funding bill this year so that we have sustainable funding, that whenever you're funded through one entity, you can get more funding through the state level, through the Career Connect Washington initiative by the governor. So I'm trying to connect our young people to jobs, and that's my main thing, is because our kids want money. Like, they want to start businesses, they are entrepreneurs, they are creative thinkers, artists. And so if you have a skill, you should be able to get funding to take it to the next level. And so that's what I want to do, and that's what we're starting to do, I think, this year.
Awesome. You are a true politician. That's a very political answer. All right, let's move on to Lieutenant Michael Kofi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's coffee.
Coffee, okay, like coffee. All right, Lieutenant Michael Coffee. So you're here representing the Federal Way Police Department, correct? And so we want to know, how can we partner with the police department to create that bridge?
I think just at beginning, just getting connected with organizations like this, and like what Mr. Bell is doing with Game of Life. I know I've spoken with him in the past and just heard the outreach that he has and the passion that he has, especially locally. For me, I work in the city of Federal Way, so really making those local connections, and Mr. Bell is, you know, in the neighborhoods, out communicating with people. And then for us in law enforcement, it really is just becoming more engaged in the community, where we're not connecting with people just during times of trauma or times of police enforcement action, but being able to connect with people one-on-one, and that way we can engage with the folks of our community as people and not just as law enforcement. And I think that's sometimes a gap that we miss out on, is making those independent community connections in all of our communities. Federal Way is an exceptionally diverse city, and sometimes the cultural differences that we experience in all of those areas are challenging for us to make those connections with. So being open to receiving some of the support from the community and engaging with them and seeing where it is that we can be a help, being an outreach in those regards, and in the schools, and being able to connect with the youth before they engage in other activity. I really think it's important to connect with youth before they get engaged with criminal activity and other associated communications that they have with youth in a negative context. Once they start down a road, it's really tough to bring people back. It can be done, but the road is much harder for those individuals who have made mistakes. Some of them haunt them for their entire life, and to be able to get the outreach to them ahead of time and early, I think, is the best way to do that. And for us, it's just, again, making those community connections and being a part of organizations like this, and the discussion. Where is it that the community sees us falling short in making some of those connections that we're not seeing as part of law enforcement? So hopefully with communication conversations like this, and just kind of being able to reach out to the local city, and then regionally as we talk about King County as a whole and their incarceration level, and how we can help youth and young adults get past some of these hurdles that we're facing. Hopefully we can make a difference moving forward.
Just as a follow-up, one of the things I do know about police departments is they do what's called a ride-along. Does Fred Away do that? And what is that? Does that help build a community?
I think that ride-alongs are a huge value. I know with COVID we had to suspend some of those things, but ride-alongs are available to anybody who is a community member or who's an applicant. And that's another area I think we can really reach out to the youth, is empowering them to get into law enforcement and to make changes and be a part of the community in that regard. We have an Explorer program, which is a great opportunity for young teens and adults to get exposure to law enforcement, to kind of see what it is that law enforcement does. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what law enforcement is and what the expectations are and what our goals are. I got into law enforcement early on because I wanted to have a career that we helped people in. And I think sometimes that message gets missed because we are connecting with people usually under negative circumstances. And unfortunately, we don't always communicate that message really clearly, that our goal is to help people. And I think that's what all of our goals are up here, is to really be a help to our community and the people that we reach, and our families as well. And so hopefully we can start that process. Ride-alongs are a great way. I think the Explorer program would be a great opportunity for youth of various communities to get engaged in and to see that process. See if it is a career path for them. Representative Johnson mentioned those opportunities in those trades. Those are great tools for young folks, especially who maybe choose not to go to college. They can't afford the financial burdens that come with that, but to be able to jump into a good paying job with some of those benefits ahead of time and really come out of school that way. Law enforcement can be the same thing, and the Explorer program is one of those tools that can be used to move forward and get engaged in the community in that regard.
Awesome, thank you so much for that answer. We're gonna move on to Alan Nance. And so you're representing the Division of Detention, right, in King County?
That's correct.
All right, so do you see a racial disparity in the detention centers and jails?
Sadly, the answer is yes. The disproportionality of people of color in our justice system is an example of the challenges that people of color face in so many of our systems, in our school systems, folks who live in poverty, individuals who are challenged by not having access to resources in the neighborhoods where they live, and that manifests itself into the kind of conduct and the associations that so many of our young people have that result in involvement with our juvenile legal system and ultimately in detention. And so we know that if we do a better job of helping support our young people when they are young, in their schools, in their neighborhoods, with programs like Aydepi, with programs like Out of the Box, that are willing to work with our young people, provide them with mentorship and guidance. We know that we can change the circumstances of disproportionality for our youth. The sad thing is, so many of the young people that we see in juvenile detention have many things in common, aside from the color of their skin, aside from the fact that they are a BIPOC youth. Recognizing that these are young people who perhaps don't have adult mentors in their lives, may not have a father figure living in the household, providing them with the guidance and support that they need. As Representative Johnson described, many of these young people are struggling just to make it day to day, just to be able to put food on the table, to have the economic resources just to survive. And that should not be the case. But it is for far too many of our youth, far too many of our immigrant youth. And so the real challenge for all of us is to figure out where are the needs, what are the resources that are available, so that we can turn the tide, disrupt the school to prison pipeline, create opportunities for young people of color to be as successful as we know that they can. And that's what we're committed to do at the Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention. It shouldn't be the case that a young person has to come to juvenile detention to get a physical, to get dental care, to have caring, supportive adults that are willing to mentor as our juvenile detention officers are. But that is the reality for far too many young people in King County. And while we've made tremendous progress in reducing the number of young people that are in detention, there are 20 young people in detention, perhaps 20 too many. But it's a far cry from the over 200 young people that were in that facility more than a decade ago. So we still have a lot of work to do. There is still an incredible challenge before us. But young people of color do not have to have the juvenile detention facility in their lives. But we collectively have to do our job to make sure that that never happens.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause. And Fiona, do you have a question for one of our panelists?
Yes, I do. So I would like to begin with Lieutenant. Okay, so I think it's in everybody's mind, like when we see the social medias and when we look at TV, we see a lot of injustices that, you know, police officers cause people of color. And I wanted to ask that why aren't the police officers held accountable for their actions? So as seen over the years, many police officers are either given a slap on the wrist or go unpunished on injustices they have caused, especially to people of color. Like, it will take riots, it will take demonstrations for them, you know, to be like, for them to face what they have caused, you know, other people of color. And I just wanted to see what's your take on that.
Well, I think that's a huge question to try to answer. You know, we're dealing with a lot of circumstances in this country. We've seen the media, we've seen the news, we've seen the riots. I think every circumstance, every event that occurs is individual and unique. I think in this state, especially in this county, we're making some significant strides toward improving those things. From my experience, I've been involved in investigations related to uses of force. And I know that we are striving as best as we can to minimize and reduce those concerns for all the community. I can't stand here and tell you that I understand and can sympathize, or that I understand or have experienced the same things that people of color have in their communications and interactions with law enforcement. Those are things that are just not in my background. But I can try to empathize with those and recognize that there are concerns. And I know that families of color are sharing with their family members and the youth that their concerns about engagement with law enforcement. I think we can start making some of those changes by having these type of interactions. I know there's legislation, reform legislation that's been in place, or that's going forward, and we're looking at making some of those changes. There's balances to that. Unfortunately, the things that we do in law enforcement and trying to protect people sometimes are not positive in the way that we have to deal with things. The goal is to keep people safe. We do need to make sure that we have eliminated or reduced any disparity in the way that we enforce those laws. They should be conducted and enforced equally, no matter what the person's skin color is. And so I do recognize that there are those concerns. Community members that I've been in contact with have expressed those things to me as we go out and we investigate crimes. They've shared their concerns. They don't want to speak to me as an officer, let alone an officer who's white, and there's concerns. They don't know that I'm going to be compassionate or going to understand those experiences that they have. And all that I can do is express to them that I recognize that you have concerns. I'm here to listen to you and to try to be a part of that. I don't necessarily have an answer on how we can hold people accountable differently than we have. We're making those changes. We're trying to make sure that people who commit bad acts, whether they're officers or not, are held accountable. We also know that there are a significant number of law enforcement contacts with every individual, and that a lot of those go very well, and we are a help to all of the communities that we serve. That's the goal. So it's sad for me in law enforcement, to know that there is this concern when I go contact families, especially families of color, that they worry about how I'm going to interact with them. Is this going to be another stereotypical story of how law enforcement interacts with a family and engages that? But I hope that we can start to move forward with reform legislation, with some of the things that we see. There is a difference. The community has spoken up and has, indicated their concern. And so these are the steps that we take forward to try to ensure that those things don't happen in the future. Unfortunately, we can't go back and change the past. We can just learn from it and try to become better as we move forward.
I'd like to say something to you, police officer, Lieutenant Coffee. Let me ask the crowd as well. Everybody knows who George Floyd was, right? I'm pretty sure everyone knows that. And I believe that George Floyd was not the first black man to die. I would say that. But I do believe that that was the cracking point for our community. As everybody has died, when George Floyd died, we can clearly see that this was different. That this was the cracking point in our community, and people went crazy. And so I think people were upset. And what I would say is this: I think this is even more of a solution would be if we had 10 bad police officers that for whatever reason, let's say they happened to be racist, we would wish that the other 1,000 police officers would join us and say, hey, this was wrong, but I don't think that support was there. I felt like the 1,000 joined with the 10, which made 1,010 bad officers. So I think that's what, as a community, we saw, which it might not have been the case, but we would have loved to see that the police would have been like, okay, no, that was wrong, you need to be held accountable. But we felt like everybody was all together, that they all supported what happened. So I want you to speak on what happened last year, because we protested last year. And here we are a year later, and we're talking about road to zero youth incarceration.
And I think as far as my perception, being in law enforcement, the people that I serve with, especially in the instance of George Floyd, stood up and said, hey, that was not an appropriate action that was taken. That was different than what you would constitute as a standard arrest for an offense, right? The officers that I worked with were offended by those actions as an officer. So that's, from my perspective, that's what I witnessed. Unfortunately, that is not the way it was portrayed out in the media. And so I can see where, as a community, you look at that and say, no, it's not just a bad officer. It's not just 10 bad officers. It's the collective of officers who feel this way, and they're willing to just justify any action because it's another officer. But I don't know that I'm going to be able to convince you today that that is not the experience that I had working with the officers in Federal Way. We looked at those videos. We looked at all the same things that were on the media, and examined those and said, that was not an appropriate action. Looking at the individual who committed that act that led to the death of Mr. Floyd. So I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's collectively as a whole. I do think policing in the Northwest, especially in the Seattle area and King County, is probably very different than it is in other areas of this country. So I can't speak for how the other regions of our country reacted or how their officers responded. I can tell you how the officers that I engaged with responded. I didn't hear anybody who responded and said, hey, you know what, that was perfectly appropriate. We didn't see anything wrong with that. That's not any of what I heard from the officer level as we interact with each other. We looked at and we experienced some updates to our training. How can we update our training? How can we change the way that we respond to make sure that this is not the case when we go out and we have a contact with anybody and make an arrest? We need to look at our practices, our policies, make sure there's nothing within our agency that we would commit such an act. I know we do get annual bias-based police training. We get training on how to identify implicit and explicit biases and to try to ensure that any enforcement action that we take is not based on somebody's skin color or their sexual orientation or their religion, and really just being sure that we focus on impartial policing. It is a constant focus, a constant communication that we have in law enforcement. And I don't think that gets shared in the community as a collective and as a whole. And that's why I'm hoping that by being able to express those things to the group today, be a part of these open discussions, that we can start sharing that with the community. That, you know, it's not that we are supportive of the officer who committed those actions. And so it's tough because there is a lot of media out there that does portray law enforcement as a whole as just siding with law enforcement for whatever reason, but that's not the case, at least from the interactions that I've had with officers, especially in a federal way.
You know, I think one of the tough things to acknowledge, especially in this country, is, you know, law enforcement is just a reflection of society, and we have, as probably everyone in this room knows, we have a vicious legacy of slavery and white supremacy, and it plays out in every institution. So it's not just law enforcement, it's education, it's public health, it's our economy. It's just, the difference is, of course, police have state-sanctioned power over life with a badge and a gun. And so it's a little bit different. However, I think like this opportunity in this space right here is a first step, listening to one another. And I appreciate Lieutenant Coffey being here, because that's a big step. I mean, to step into this space, the only officer, is a big step. But I think sometimes we then jump steps to, we try to reconcile. And before reconciliation, you have to acknowledge truth. And a part of the issue is a vast majority of law enforcement will not acknowledge the racial disparities in violence. George Floyd was not a one-time thing. This has been happening for decades. We just finally had video evidence, and thank goodness for that 17-year-old girl who, in my mind, deserves a Medal of Freedom or of honor for having that video, because without that, we would never have known, and would have been another black male that died at the hands of police, and nothing would have happened. Now, I think in Washington State in particular, because we are seen as a progressive state and we're trying to do better, we have to lead in this space. So that's why this year I was proud to work directly with community and law enforcement on these issues, and it was not easy conversations. We were, you know, especially virtually where you don't have that relationship like here in person, we had tough conversations late into the night where we had to lift up every voice, even the voices we didn't want to hear, and we talked through these issues. Now, I think we achieved accountability, which is retroactive. So now if you commit an act of violence towards a community member, an officer will be held accountable. There will be independent investigations. There will be a process now that we never have had before to hold that officer accountable. What we have not yet achieved is justice, which is proactive, meaning George Floyd would never have happened. Breonna Taylor would never have happened. In Tacoma up the street, Manny Ellis would never have happened, because there would have been policies and procedures in place to prevent it. And so I think justice is our next step, and that's where we have to take a step forward in this state in trying to prevent that by creating more relationships with police, by diversifying our police and law enforcement departments. But it's also going to be an acknowledgement of truth that has to happen at every local level. And so I think that that's our next step, and that's our next mission and vision, hopefully for law enforcement, is reimagining what public safety looks like. It's working more with our mental health professionals, and that's not the law enforcement's job. That's policymakers like myself to put that in place and make sure that happens.
So this question is for Alan Nance. And so I was doing my research on the juvenile detention centers, and I noticed that one major negative drawback of the detention centers was the issue of recidivism, which is the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. So in an article in 2019 written by the US Sentencing Commission, it showed that over 64% of youth sent in juvenile detention centers are convicted of violent crimes within the 8 years after they have served in the detention centers, and 40% of those were convicted of non-violent offenses. So I think, so for what we've learned about juvenile detention centers, it provides a space for reform rather than punishment. But why is it like 64% of those sent there are prone to reoffend, you know? And why are they, 64% are charged with violent crimes and 40 are charged with non-violent crimes? So what's your take on this, and how does your detention center look?
Wow, Fiona, that's a pretty awesome question. So, but thank you for asking it. So a couple of things I want to say about that. Juvenile detention facilities are typically a place where young people come before they are found guilty of their offense. And so it is sort of a place where you're in custody while the courts decide what is going to happen with your case. And once that decision is made, a young person may be placed on probation, where they're allowed to go back home and live with their family and be under supervision of a juvenile probation counselor, or they may be committed to the state juvenile prison, which is juvenile rehabilitation. And many of those statistics come from the longer term facilities, post-adjudication, post-disposition, after they've been sentenced, where the expectation is that there is programming going on, that there is actual rehabilitation happening for those young people. And sadly, our systems are badly broken. Unfortunately, far too many young people don't get what they need while they're in those environments. And so we have to do better than just simply housing young people in custody, warehousing young people in custody. We have to recognize that many of these young people have experienced trauma. Many of these young people need substance abuse treatment. Many of these young people lack supports within their community, family members, community members that they're connected to, so that when they return home, they have a job opportunity. They have post-secondary education opportunities. They have vocational training programs that can help them get to a place where they can have a career. And without those things, without those resources, the recidivism will continue to be high. And that's why we need to reimagine how our systems work. We need to reimagine what our focus is when we have young people in custody. And we have to make sure that we have fewer of them going into custody, getting their needs met in community before they get to that point where they become part of the recidivist statistic.
Thank you for that. Did you have a follow-up? Did you guys have any follow-up questions? Can you explain the concept of community policing? We've heard that so many times. We need to go back to community policing, and we'll start with Jesse Johnson.
I think it's a nuanced question, but I would say from my lens, it's a procedural justice issue. It's what is the procedure when the 911 dispatcher calls there's a crime and officers have to show up. I think we are starting to get there in the mental health space. In our state, we need more funding for it, but right now we have a program called DCR, Designated Crisis Response, where If 911 dispatcher says it's a mental health situation of any kind, they send out a mental health professional with the law enforcement officer. The mental health professional is supposed to do an assessment or a risk assessment to see if that person is an imminent harm to an officer, the family, or themselves even. And so once that assessment is done and it's said, well, this person needs to get help, the officer is there to transport them through an EMT or ambulance to a mental health facility. One of the issues we have, though, is there's different definitions of imminent harm. So it's based on that individual there or that officer to determine, is that person gonna hurt themselves or someone else in that moment? And so we have to do a better job at defining what imminent harm looks like. I personally think it should be a lower threshold because I think there's too many cases where officers leave the scene, that person goes and commits a crime, or that person harms a family member or themselves. And so I think we need to, as a state, we need to lower the threshold, and that's a part of community policing, is working with our community on what that looks like. When a young person is stopped or questioned by police, there should be designated community-based folks arriving at the scene with the officer to help support that individual and their family, because too many times that young person then ends up on the street, and that's where we see a lot of issues. And I think we have a lot of work to do because we haven't created the partnerships like through these organizations to help with that effort. And I think there should be a pathway. I mean, there should be licensed professionals that work in frontline responding to these situations to work with our law enforcement. We don't have pathway programs if you want to be a youth, juvenile, mental health professional. There's not a lot of programs to do that work. And if there are, they're not really well paid. And so we have to do a better job at creating those pathways, because a lot of our young folks want to help their peers. They don't want to see their peers arrested at school. That's why we had the youth access to an attorney bill this year, because when a young person is stopped in school by a school resource officer and questioned, a lot of times they end up saying things that is then later used in courts, and now they're behind bars or in the juvenile legal system, when they could have spoken to an attorney with juvenile legal expertise to help them navigate that conversation with the officer. So now it's mandated. When a young person under 18 is stopped, they have to have a consultation for an hour with an attorney before talking to the officer. So I think a lot of these things are a part of community policing because it helps prevent the situation like Mr. Nance talked about, where now they have to get help and it has to be in a juvenile legal facility versus within the community, within community-based programs in the town that they live in. And I think that's where our problems arise, because now you have a record, now you can't get a job, now you can't get access to housing. And so we have a lot of work to do, and I think a lot of it is procedural justice, is how we are reimagining our procedures to help that young person.
And I think there's a lot that Representative Johnson has said that we can look at. For us in law enforcement, when we think of community policing, it's really about us as law enforcement getting out into the community and establishing those connections, being out with the people that we serve. And back decades ago, you had what was called an officer friendly, right? The neighborhood knew who the officer was that was in their patrol area, and you recognized them, and the officer recognized the people that they're serving. And I think we've gotten away from that. Some of the challenge with that is staffing models with all of law enforcement. We're stretched so thin. Our minimum staffing during the day for our city of almost 100,000 people is 7 during daylight hours, and then between 2 and midnight we have 9. It's really hard to be engaged with community members when you have all of these calls for service coming in. And we deal a lot with mental health calls. And I know a lot of the challenges. I'm not a mental health professional, and I don't necessarily know how to assess somebody who's in crisis with a mental health need. Is in the procedural things, we haven't seen the benefit to some of these programs that send out mental health professionals. I've called several times to have somebody come out, and you've been denied access to a mental health professional coming out and doing an assessment on somebody, or even trying to minimize my contact with somebody who's in crisis and requesting a mental health professional come out to the scene rather than me go respond there, because I am in uniform, and I know that in interacting with somebody in a crisis, maybe a person in uniform is not the best person to interact with them. I have a limited number of tools that I can work with. And so being denied access to some of those mental health professionals coming out there really becomes challenging. It is engaging community partners. It is becoming engaged in the communities that we work in and really establishing those relationships. That's part of what I think is a component of that community policing, and really working together with resources like this organization or like Mr. Bell's organization, and establishing a good working partnership with regards to, you know, the imminent threat in a mental health case. It's really difficult for us in law enforcement and to speak to family members who are suffering with members in crisis. They're dealing with sometimes a young family member or even decades worth of mental health issues. And where do you draw that line? When is an imminent threat? They said they don't want to harm somebody, but you walk away and 5 minutes later they're in a different place. They have a mental health issue. They're maybe bipolar or schizophrenic, and their mood and demeanor changes really rapidly. So being able to engage with mental health professionals that can make that assessment and give a better understanding is really a huge part. Mental health calls are a large portion of what policing is doing right now, and it's really difficult for us to facilitate those things. So as we work with community partners as part of community policing, but then also being present in the communities to be a more friendly face and recognizable and engage. And I know that's really difficult to kind of get over that hurdle because we haven't done that for a long time. But hopefully we can start seeing that become more prevalent. And as we get a more diversified police force, we get people in different communities and different cultural backgrounds who can share those things with each other and really engage in the city and in the county to make this a better organization and to better service the people of our city and of our state.
I'll be brief. Just one thing I would say is I really don't like the term community policing, and maybe I'm alone with that. But some of our communities feel that they're over-policed. And I think that what we're really talking about is community and police partnership. It really is about community-oriented policing. That there is an expectation and a belief that community and police need to do the job together, and that one can't exist without the other. And so creating community and police partnerships is the way to get to the healthy relationships between communities and the police that serve their neighborhoods.
Thank you guys. But first, Lieutenant here. As Jesse said, I'm a kid from Federal Way as well. I went to Green Gables, I went to Lakota Middle School, Decatur, I ended up going to Highline and then kept going. Lieutenant Coffee, this is the first time I've ever seen you. And I've lived here almost my entire life. So how can we get you, I just haven't seen you guys out here. The only time I see is if you guys pulled somebody over. But I've seen Jesse several times. I've seen him walking around, he's doing this, he's doing that. It's the first time I've seen you guys, Mr. Allen here. And so how can we see you guys out there? I know you said that the staff is limited, but the thing is, we're not seeing your guys' face out there. There's no connection whatsoever, unless it's I'm in trouble or this. Some of us don't know your name, we feel scared. There's a lot of trauma in our community. And I think that's what it is, that we're scared to even approach an officer. If I get pulled over by an officer, I'm scared for my life. I don't know how this might end up. When that might not even be the case, but already that trauma that's been there in the past is already affecting me. And so what I would say is this, I think a solution to this is preventing the crime before it happens. Because I think, of course you guys have to do law enforcement, but I feel like if we prevented the crimes with getting the right resources, if we could get the young guys to talk to you guys, if we could have these conversations, this should not be the only event we should be having once a year or every few months. We should be having this with our boys to men, with Aydepi, what they have going on, Game of Life, Phenomenal Sheep. We have programs that we want to see you guys part of, but we're not getting that engagement from you. We're not getting that the resources that we need to get you guys out there. Lieutenant.
So I wasn't out engaging the community the way that some of our patrol officers have. I know we have several officers who do, and I've seen the benefit too, being engaged with the people that you work with. It's helped me as an investigator, working cases. sometimes the most serious offenses. And when I go into a community or I go into a house and somebody like yourself looks at me and says, I don't trust you, so I'm not going to share information with you regarding this homicide. That's a failure on our part. And I acknowledge that. Like, we have failed to establish a connection. And there's nothing that I can do to, in that moment, to overcome that. That's something that takes time. It takes time to build those relationships. So it is part of establishing those community partnerships. Like this, here, trying to say, I want to be a face in the community. I want to be a part of these discussions that will make us better and make it so that when you do have an interaction with law enforcement, it's not only when there's a traumatic time or when you're being pulled over. Again, I can't sit here and say, I know what you're experiencing when you're being pulled over. I haven't lived in your shoes or any of the shoes of most of the people here to know that fear or that hesitation or that concern. What's going to happen to me? So all I can try to do is move forward and share with you that the officers of Federal Way want to be a part of this community. We want to be out there and engaging, and we have failed to some degree because that's something that you've obviously expressed is a concern you've had growing up here. And you're a long-term resident of the city. So I know that the police department has tried to engage with Game of Life recently, and Phenomenal She, I think, as well, with Mr. Bell and those programs. So those are all starts. You struck the nail on the head. We have to stop the crime before it happens. We have to get to the youth of this city and of the state before they get down a pathway where they have long-term consequences from it. It starts in the family, and it starts in the community, and then it also encompasses schools and law enforcement, and really partnering up and helping families get the resources they need. Because you have a 13 or 14-year-old that commits a violent crime, there was something that happened before they turned 13 or 14 that got them down that road. How do we as a community, how do we collectively help children so they don't get to that place at 13 or 14 where they're comfortable committing that type of crime? So those are the challenges, those are the answers that are going to take time for us to resolve, whether they're establishing community connections, using law enforcement as a tool, getting mental health involved early, talking about how the criminal justice system works. I know a lot of the cases that I have worked from the detective side of things, we work with the juvenile justice department to engage youth in programs that will ensure that they don't get a criminal record moving forward, but they get counseling services and they get resources provided to them so that they can make positive steps moving forward. Obviously, in the most serious offenses, when we're talking about weapons offenses, when we're talking about murders, we still have an obligation to our community to make people safe in those situations. But being able to facilitate dialogue like this and engage and hopefully reach the youth today. You're looking at teen to 25, but really it's about connecting with those people and then connecting with the 5 to 13-year-olds so that when they are 13, they're at a better place. They have a better support system. They have a better network at home. They have the resources that they need to be successful so that when they get to a position where either they're going to college or they're going into one of these trade programs, they have all the tools that they need to be successful in adulthood. That's the goal of everybody, is to make everybody, provide them with the opportunity to be successful as they move forward. So I hope that we can establish more of these type of dialogues. I apologize that we've never met before.
I'd like to interject something real quick, and I'd ask Jesse as well. I know there was a large budget spent on new police cars in our community, and I don't know if that's true, but I don't know if the police officers got new cars. I don't know how much million you guys spent on getting new cars, but I want to know, how can we get that same effective, I'll use this word, how can we get that same energy towards our community, towards these guys out here? And this is not everybody's here. I'd say we probably have collectively 500, 600 of us. This is just who's here today. How can we get that same energy of funding and support the same way you guys are getting funding for new equipment or whatever, staffing, whatever? How can we get that as well?
Before I answer Justice's question, I think something that really struck me that you said, Lieutenant Coffey, was prevention. And when I think about the fact that most of our young people, we literally make criminals out of our young people because they're not threats to society. But a lot of times when you get in a physical fight in school, or you get caught smoking marijuana, or you get caught somewhere where you're not supposed to be, we have these paper trails that start from, that's the school to prison pipeline, from elementary, middle school, and beyond. And we're literally telling our young people, you are a threat to society, you are a criminal, and we make them into something we don't want them to be. And so a lot of, I think, of bad policy, it starts with who's in office, and I think we have a lot of work to do on that, and we have to listen to our community. The answers are in the community. Listen to our families, what's happening, and start changing that. So that's on folks like myself, folks like Mr. Nance to work together and make sure that those changes are implemented in our policy. But to answer your question, Justin, I think advocacy is super important. One of the things we saw last summer after the murder of George Floyd was a tremendous showing of solidarity, people from all ethnicities, all backgrounds coming together to demand a public mandate to demand change. And that's why I believe it was 35 out of our 50 states implemented some level of police reform. First time in our country's history that's ever happened. But it was after a summer of protesting and agitating the system to change. We need that same level at a local level with the city council meetings. I wanted to see that happen here in Federal Way when I was on the city council. How can we get more community engaged at the council meetings? Because the loudest voices get what they want in policy. That's just how it works, it's a fact. And it may not be right, and a lot of times some of our communities don't want to show up at City Hall or the state capitol because it's trauma. I mean, you're showing up where you have security, you have guards like Lieutenant Coffey standing there at the doorways with guns. It's scary, but we have to build coalitions. We have to plot, plan, and strategize, and organize, and mobilize our community to come out and to show their faces and to demand change. Because that's what we saw, that's what works. And I'm hoping that we can replicate that process at every level because I think it's important. That's how we see the changes we want to see and the funding go to where we want to go.
Awesome. So we have 2 more questions and then we'll be done with section and we'll open it up to the floor. So this is for all 3 of you because I think you can answer this. I remember back, I did a paper on mass incarceration, and even before that, I went to 911 driving school, which is taught by retired police officers, and one of my instructors told us one day, if you ever get stopped by a motorcycle cop, don't even try to get out of that because their job is to give tickets all day, every day. That's why you don't see motorcycle cops going to shootouts and things like that, right? That's not their job, is to give tickets. And he said something about they have quotas that they have to meet every month, right? And the first thing is like, officers have a quota, meaning they have a goal each month they have to get of how many tickets they need to give. And I think that's a broken system, right? Why is law enforcement monetized, right? It's not about money, right? It's not a private entity. And so that's one of the things that shocked me. The other thing was, when I looked into mass incarceration, they talked about private prisons. Private prisons, meaning they're for-profit prisons. And so they have like a hospital, they have to fill up their beds, each night. And so, can you guys talk about the broken system? Because it's really broken if we're talking about private prisons and, motorcycle cops having to meet a quota every month.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that we have to monetize our police or our criminal justice systems in any fashion. Because once we start focusing on the dollars in the work that people do, we start to diminish the quality of the work that they need to do. And that is a challenge for our communities. And I've lived in other communities in California and Illinois where similar circumstances existed. The budgets were tight, and if you were gonna keep police officers on the street, then you needed to generate some form of revenue. And that's a backward system, that's a broken system. So Tyrus, I completely agree with that. I think we have to eliminate our reliance on for-profit prison industry because it perpetuates racism, it perpetuates inequity, and that is a problem for our communities, and it's a problem for our young people because they don't have a chance from the very start. If these other powerful industrial systems are dependent on black and brown bodies in order to survive, then we should not be surprised when black and brown bodies end up in their beds.
to Mr. Nance's point, it goes back to Dr. King. He talked about the three evils of society: militarism, racism, and materialism. And they're all connected here in our country. Democracy is a social experiment, but capitalism is global. This is something that America has really taken to another level, and a part of it is tied to how we are producing jobs in our society. If you notice, all the prisons are in, or most of the prisons are in rural parts of our state to hopefully provide jobs for rural parts of our state. We finally just closed the Northwest Detention Center, or we're gonna close the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma and ban private prisons because of the unfair treatment, the terrible facilities there, and a lot of it has come at the cost of Black and brown bodies. So how do we then look at how we're reforming our prison system in a way that creates more public safety? However, but I think one of the things though is, again, we're tied to big money, we're tied to corporations, and how do we eliminate that out of our political process? That's a tough thing to do, and I think we're just at the beginning of that in this state this year, but we have a lot of work to do to get rid of that transfer of power from corporations to politicians to our juvenile systems to our carceral systems, and that is part of our challenge in order to dismantle some of the systematic problems that we see.
I'll address the first huge myth that officers have quotas for tickets. That is a falsehood. I've never been issued a quota for a ticket. None of our traffic officers have ever been issued quotas for tickets. They are encouraged to use tickets as an enforcement tool. Motorcycle officers are typically our traffic officers, so yes, they're doing traffic enforcement. Enforcement and education, and responding to collisions, to collision investigation and serious collision investigations. So I've never heard of an agency that has issued quotas. I'm sure there are some out there, and I don't know what agency that person retired from. A police department is not a business.
Is that an issue if agencies are doing that? Is that an issue if they have quotas that the officers have to meet?
Again, I don't know of anybody that has ever issued quotas. I think it does become an issue, right? Where you're saying, hey, you need to go generate a financial revenue for this. We're not a business entity. We can't operate as a business entity. There's too many issues with that. I mean, you look at, if you have a homicide, you can't say, can we budgetarily fund the investigation for this homicide to say, hey, sorry, we've ran out of money for that homicide. Your family doesn't get any more investigation. So law enforcement is a unique environment in regards to that. The financial aspect of traffic enforcement is supposed to be an education. It's a penalty for violating some sort of law. The way that I was trained, and I've always done it, is you have two methods of enforcement. You have education through a lecture, so I might give you a lecture and say, hey, this is what you violated. I'm not going to issue you a ticket today, but here's all the things that you did, or you get a traffic ticket. But with regards to private prisons, I know the representation is working on eliminating those. Other states have a far greater number of private prisons, and I know there's challenges with those. I think anytime you run a governmental entity as a business, it becomes a struggle to separate the two, right? How do I keep this operation running when it's not a financially solvable issue, right? If all you rely on is how many beds you fill, of course you're going to keep one hot piece in a bed. I mean, that's just the general rule of how we all work, right? If I can put more money in the bank account, well, then I'm probably going to do that to support my family. So I know in King County, we are not run private prisons. I think it's only the detention center is Tacoma that was a private entity. So I think we do a better job around here, but there are challenges with that. Obviously, that's not any representation of law enforcement, whether it's through that or through the incarceration side, is really benefiting from being privatized. So I think we're better off with government in that regard, because then it does allow the legislature to be a check and balance for that, right? And as law enforcement, we are a branch of the government. We're an enforcement branch of the government. So we operate when the we agree with under the laws that are imposed on us. Those laws should be representative of what the people ask us to do. We are here for the people. We are to be service for the people as law enforcement. There's always hurdles with that. We want to protect, provide for safety, and sometimes those laws make it challenging for us to do that. Ultimately, we need to just remember that that's our place, is to serve the communities that we're in to the level that they ask us to. And we're not private businesses. But hopefully nobody thinks we have full control. So I don't know whether Officer need that information.
All right, last question, please, Nancy.
After this conversation that we've had, I think one major issue with the countries that on the topic of race. So, the word race and its ideology has been associated with a negative history of slavery. Furthermore, we have learned and heard from multiple scholars and scientists throughout the years that the word has nothing to do with any physical variations, but rather was formed to justify slavery. Why do we still use race as a major classification and identification in this country? Because when we get to go out there, the only thing that we've seen in major universities, when we are asked to identify yourself, when you're asked to, even in our IDs and our birth certificate, it's something that we have to, right there. And if it has such a negative history, and if it has such a, bad background, why do we still use it to identify ourselves? Because I can think of multiple ways where each individual can identify themselves. And I remember asking this question to another friend of mine, who is my professor, and he said that the reason why they've maintained the word is because of statistics. And they want to see how many black people are in certain institutions and something like that, but there are multiple ways to identify individuals rather than a racist word, So I want to hear each and every one of you.
I'll go first, I'll be short. I think that anything can be misused. And so even if we took race out of the picture, we know that there are disparities and discrimination based on a whole host of other characteristics that people have. Are you male? Are you female? Are you gay? Are you straight? Are you black? Are you white? And so I think that we have a very dysfunctional relationship with race in this country, and it continues to adversely impact people of color. And so we need to do something about that. We need to deal with the implicit and explicit bias that Lieutenant Coffey talked about. But I don't know that we ever eliminate it. And I don't know that we never should, for that matter. I'm proud that I'm a person of color. I'm proud of my blackness. I am proud of the contributions that people of color have made to this country. And I don't think we should ignore that. But I do think we need to challenge the dysfunctional relationship that we have with race, and we need to eliminate the disparities that are based on race in this country.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think it's not race that has to be eliminated, but racism, because that's what our country was founded on. It was founded on indigenous invisibility and black inferiority. And so what we have to do, I think a lot of times, is look at what's happening in our system. A lot of times race is a predictor of an individual's life outcome, whether it's if someone's gonna get incarcerated or arrested, or if they're gonna be able to buy a home, if they're gonna be able to get a certain job. And that's unfortunate. And we wanna move past racism, which stems from race, which is a social construct. Race was invented. It's not something that literally physically or scientifically exists. It's something that we made up, but we made it up to build. Racism was the architecture of our racial system in America, and who's at the top and who's at the bottom. And so that's what I think we have to work to eliminate through our policies and practices and procedures in our institutions, but I think race still is, it matters, and it still is, like Mr. Nance said, you should be proud to be black, or to be German, or Italian, or Mexican, or whatever. And black is obviously all-encompassing. You should be proud to be Nigerian or Kenyan, or for my family, I don't know exactly where I came from in that way, but I know we as far back as I can remember, we come from Lubbock County, Texas, and we're always proud to be from Texas, in that part of Texas. So I think it's really a part of your culture and your ancestry that's important. However, racism is the thing that we have to work to dismantle.
Representative Johnson and Mr. Nance have spoken far more eloquently than I can on the subject. Yes, racism is different than race. I think that's should be a universal concept. I know it's not in our society at this time, but hopefully we're moving forward and making strides to make that the case. It happens in every culture and every people, unfortunately. I have a family member who's a person of color, and he talked about growing up, his skin color was not dark enough, and he was ostracized even for that alone. So, I mean, I think it's a systemic problem that we're working towards having these discussions, being open to hearing other people's points of view, I think are part of that process moving forward. And I think we're making steps there. With regards to somebody's skin color or clothing that they're wearing, I'm thinking of it from a police level, from the base function. When you call 911 and the 911 operator says, hey, what does the person look like that just committed this crime? Skin color is something that we can use to identify somebody so that we know who we're looking for. It doesn't come across really well a lot of times, especially in or for people of color who have experienced these type of traumas in their life. So it comes across as though it is, from their experience, at least what has been expressed to me, is that, hey, this is an overtly racist type of request. Police are just looking to contact a person of color. But it's really about trying to identify the right person and provide protection. I can't necessarily speak today about the systemic problems that have originated historically, but for us, I don't know that we can eliminate completely asking what somebody's appearance is. Because for us, it may be the difference between us locating the person who is committing an act of violence or not locating them and creating a greater risk to the community. So we have to, I think it's helpful if we can find a way to differentiate that from, we're not asking you specifically about your race, we're asking you, what does the person look like who committed this crime? Have the person describe that. It's down to color. It could be a blue sweater or a purple hat or whatever it may be, but it's the totality of what the person appears to be for us. That's why I think it still is relevant in our community. Plus, like Mr. Nance said, he is proud of his heritage. He's proud of his ethnicity. There's no shame in that. There's no shame in where you came from. You should be proud of it. Representative Johnson is proud to be from Texas, as most of my friends from Texas are as well. So I'm proud to be from Washington. I'm a second-generation immigrant. My mom immigrated from Europe as a young child. So, I mean, I'm proud of where she came from and the background and history that we have. It's different from other people's, but there's nothing to be ashamed of, I think, for us with regards to things like applications and statistics and the census things. Those are things that are far beyond my capability of kind of trying to overcome today, but I can see where there's challenges with that. When I mark for the census who I am, that I'm a person, do I really want to mark what my skin color is or what my ethnicity is? Do I really want to share that information? How is that relevant? I'm a person, I'm here. You've counted me. So I think as we discuss those type of things collectively, those will be addressed in the future, but I don't think we can eliminate it completely. Hopefully we can use it in the proper context of what it is and embrace people who are of color or who are white like I am and just say, hey, it doesn't matter what you look like. We judge people by their character, right? That's what we should all do and move forward in that way. We have lots of steps to take still. There's a long way to go. So it's going to be a long journey and it'll be spread across generations and generations before I think we can get some of those things resolved. But hopefully it's a process that was progressing and not declining.
Just really quickly, I wanted to just follow up super quick, I promise. But you all as young people, I always say young folks aren't just the future, but they're the present. So you can determine what you want the future to look like. And I think a lot of young folks are unapologetically, this is what the future should look like, which is really awesome to see. Because if you all decide that race should not be a factor, that's something you can do. When you get into positions of influence and impact, you can make those decisions. So I think it speaks to this event because you all as young folks are learning, you're listening, but you're also developing your own critical consciousness about what the world should look like. And you can take that to another level. What should the world look like for not only yourselves and your kids, but your grandkids, future generations? And you can have infinite impact through that. So I just really encourage you all to think about that and really take a critical self-reflection about what you think the world should look like, because that's what matters. The world is how it is today because of the past. They determine what our world should look like right now, for good or bad or worse. And the same opportunity is there for you all.
Awesome, thank you guys. So we want to open it up to you guys real quick. I know you guys sat here and listened to us. Some of you probably nodding off here and there. So we want to give you guys an opportunity to ask them a question, something that came up for you guys. Anyone have a question? All right, I'm gonna start with this gentleman here. Oh, let's start with you. Oh, okay, I thought you raised your hand.
Yeah, so my name is Kadra. This question is directed to Lieutenant. From your experience, being a lieutenant, would you say also that lack of infrastructure has played to high incarcerated rates, lack of resources coming from your experience as a lieutenant? And driving by Bellevue, you can see there's not really much policing there, but you see the presence, but it's not as lurking, or it's not as present as in Seattle. So from your experience, do you think infrastructure, lack of, can also contribute to, the current topic we're talking about now?
More expansive set of resources available to them. From the investigation side, when I was a detective, we looked at trying to work on some particular cases, burglary cases, and the question came up, well, Bellevue Police Department specifically was actually doing some pretty interesting investigative techniques, and so we were looking at implementing some of those procedures. And when I looked at their organizational chart, they had 26 detectives. We had 12. So when you look at the amount of resources that we have to facilitate these investigations, yes, I think infrastructure and resources really does play a part in some of the failures that we've had in being able to reach the community, being able to put enough officers on the street. Like you mentioned, Bellevue has a significant presence in the community as they're driving around, which is a great deterrent. I don't know if they're still making those same community connections that I hope that we do moving forward, but they're at least faces that you recognize, right? You see a patrol car driving around 2 or 3 or 4 times, or different people driving around, and it is a deterrent in from committing crime. But yeah, I think resources play a part in what we see, the ability for us to establish those community connections and to be more proactive in our policing. When we have a reduced staffing force, we unfortunately become reactive. We're only responding to crimes, and we don't have the ability to get out there and be as proactive in establishing some of those relationships that will hopefully benefit and move forward into creating a safer environment for all of us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, then we have another gentleman here with a question.
Hi, my name is Andrew. So my question goes to Alan. So let's say for example, I'm a juvenile. I've done 2 to 3 years in prison. So towards the weeks, towards leaving, going back into the community, how do you help them transition? Because some of them might feel like they want to be brought back into the community. How do you help them get back into the community?
Thank you for the question. Fortunately, it's rare that programming, making sure that they have the familial supports and a place to live that supports their progress. So reentry is the key. And I think that jurisdictions that have focused on reentry have seen better outcomes with young people coming out of their institutions.
All right, we have another question here for this lovely lady.
Hello, my name is Eunice, and this question is directed to State Representative Jesse Johnson. So what is the state doing, and what can we do as a community to help schools without enough resources, and also to reduce and combat the school to prison pipeline?
That's a great question. Yeah, very good question. So, protect the community, and we have to educate our kids. And luckily, through what's called the McCleary decision a few years back, we increased overall state funding. Now, the problem is a lot of our school funding is still tied to public levies, so it goes out to the vote of the people, whether or not you'll get enhanced funding. So our system's not built on equity, it's built on equality. Every district gets the same amount from the state. Bellevue, Redmond, Federal Way, Kent, Auburn, Tacoma, Seattle, same amount. The levy funding is what makes it go beyond that. And a lot of times in communities that are more affluent, more social economic impact, they're able to pass their levies. I grew up here. Our first time in Federal Way passing a school levy was in 2018, since I believe 1998. 20 years it took to pass a school levy. And so we have a lot of work to do around education and awareness for our own community to pass these levies so that we get increased funding. The second part of your question around school to prison pipeline. We know that we have school resource officers in our schools, and they do serve a great purpose, especially since the increase of gun violence in schools and school shootings. The number one responsibility of that SRO is to prevent a school shooting or to respond to school shooting, and to look for certain things that happen in the school that may cause a school shooting. That's why they're there. But I think what happens also is you have officers patrolling the hallways looking for something based on their job responsibility. We have to redefine what their responsibility looks like and put more restorative justice into their role, because that's where we're seeing them looking for trouble. And I asked the school resource officer last week here in Federal Way, what do you see as your primary job role? And he said to keep the peace. And to him that meant looking for a fight, looking for students disagreeing that could lead to something else. And so you're looking for negative. You're already doing it from a deficit model versus a strengths-based model. And so I think we have to redefine what their role looks like in order to begin to prevent some of that from happening. And also educating our teachers, because they call the SRO into the classroom to come respond to something happening. And so a lot of times in our state, as we all know, our teaching workforce is 85% white women. And it's very difficult for them to educate our kids. And so we have to create a better sense of training for our teachers, also diversifying our workforce, but creating a better sense of training around bias, around what different cultural dynamics. That kid may have just rode 2 school buses, they may be hungry and malnourished, they may not be able to respond in the same way as that other kid that is well-fed, that comes from a 2-parent household. We have a lot of work to do in that aspect around training, and because training is up to the local school districts, we don't have centralized training through the state. The local school districts have to do that work. And so creating, again, education and awareness for our school districts on how to respond to their specific student population, because it's not one size fits all. It has to match and reflect our kids.
All right, and the last question for this section is from this gentleman.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kelvin. Allow me to make just a few remarks, and because generally I think my question is, how can we plug this into a nationwide conversation? Now, legal justice is a very critical aspect in every successful society. The fair, just, and equal exercise of jurisprudential authority means a lot. It is critical. It is a critical pillar behind every successful society. But why would you pull me over and ask me, put your hands where I can see them, sir? Do you know why I pulled you over? And why would you pull over another one saying, good morning, sir, how are you doing? The fairness in exercising jurisprudential authority. Today we're talking about traversing the road to zero youth incarceration in the United States. Mass incarceration today is a serious civil crisis here. And while we're having the lowest rates of incarceration in 20 years, the United States still incarcerates more youth than any other country in the entire world. And to me, this means that we are not doing enough to secure our society and secure especially our youth. Now, nearly 50,000 youths every day remain in detention centers. And I disagree with very many state officials across the nation who say once an adult, always an adult, and therefore incarcerating youth in adult civil proceedings and incarcerating them in adult detention facilities. Recent cognitive neuroscience have proven that persons between the age of 18 to 25 are having their prefrontal cortex growing, and this is the area responsible for planning, controlling impulsive actions, prioritizing, and allow me to acknowledge the state of Washington for having made progress in allowing jurisprudential exceptions when dealing with young adults after the age of 25. It is wrong to convict juveniles in adult courts. It is wrong to incarcerate juveniles. What youths and young adults need is a chance to grow, a chance to learn, and a chance to achieve. Studies, I'll be very brief and wrapping up now. Studies indicate that juveniles do not reduce recidivism. Studies indicate that community-based initiatives, community-based treatments, community-based rehabilitation reduce recidivism. I would want this discussion to fuel us towards achieving community-based initiatives, community-based treatments and rehabilitation over incarceration. And maybe you can help us achieve that nationwide. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dennis. This is more of a generalized question. What type of policies or paths has you as individuals followed or would like to follow to create a better environment, especially like living on indigenous stolen land? What type of ways have you guys, or would you guys like to follow to make a better environment and a climate? Especially like a few weeks ago, we had that heat wave. The climate is not getting better. What changes would you like to see in the society and in your organizations?
I think let's go with Jesse Johnson and Alan.
For me, it's looking again at disparities, and when you look at Federal Way, we are in airport community like SeaTac, Des Moines, and Tukwila, and we experience a lot more air pollution, and that's why you see a lot of public health disparities in our area because of that pollution. And so I think we need to have stricter guidelines or standards with a lot of the federal organizations, aviation organizations around. I mean, in the last 5 years, I think I heard something like there's been a 1,000% increase in flights coming out of SeaTac Airport. And so right now I'm part of a task force looking at another airport, either up in Olympia or on the north part of Snohomish County, because we need another airport in our state. We're too big, our infrastructures cannot handle having one public airport in SeaTac. I know there's one in Spokane as well, but it's very small. So we need to look at that. California, I believe, has 6 federal airports, and we have 1 in Washington State. We have a lot of work to do on that. But I think also cleaner fuel standards. We passed the Clean Fuel Standards bill this year to make sure that oil corporations are held accountable for the amount of oil being produced that's leading to a lot of the climate issues that we're seeing. So, and then bolstering up our fire department, making sure that we have more crisis response is something that we're looking at. Again, a lot of this work is so new though. Climate justice is a new concept that it's probably been around a while, but it has momentum for the first time, I think, in the last few years. So we're looking at a lot of those issues because, again, we have to have a world for our young folks that is literally a world, first of all, and then secondly, a world that is clean and healthy and for them to thrive. So looking at disparities and where the problems exist, and a lot of the problems I see in our state are due to the airport.
Dennis, thanks for the question. As somebody who lives in SeaTac, a block away from the airport, I can certainly appreciate the challenges that we see and I experience every day with respect to air traffic and the concern about the emissions that air traffic causes in our community. I want to tie your question back to the young people that I see in juvenile detention. And I think that one of the ways that we can combat the challenges associated with climate is in creating more opportunities for green jobs for our young people. Solar panels, windmills, helping them to understand wave technology and how that can be used to create alternative sources of energy, but at the same time, creating opportunities for jobs. Because at the end of the day, our young people need sustainable economic opportunity in order to survive in this community. And so I think that those are opportunities and ways that we can combine both our commitment to our climate, but also our commitment to our young people in their future as well.
Well, these gentlemen obviously expressed some pretty clear pathways moving forward regarding climate change. For me personally, moving forward to try to make this community of Federal Way better, it's really about making the people safer all around. And recognizing that Federal Way is a very diverse socioeconomic and cultural area. So we have a number of ways that we need to address those specific concerns for each of those groups of people that we represent. Because for every community it is a little bit different. They have different concerns to address, different things that they're looking at that make their personal lives better. So hopefully more communication really begins this process. As Representative Johnson said, he's early in kind of the progress on these type of things, and it all starts from communication and dialogue and really being able to answer the questions as best we can. Your question is far broader than what I can do personally as a police officer in the city of Federal Way, but I can try to be a resource and a help to make the city safer so that you feel like you have a better opportunity to now become part of the legislative process, to become part of the action groups that will make that change moving forward. Because really, if you don't feel safe going out in your community, that's the first hurdle, right? You have to be safe at home. You have to feel like you have a place that you can find for your refuge, and then you can invest the time into making your community better. So that's how I hope to be able to be a part of making things better for you, and so that you can now be an active member of this city and this community and making those changes as we go forward from here.
All right, thank you. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, please. So that concludes this section, and so you guys remain here. We're gonna move these tables, and we're gonna do a little photo shoot, and then Beatrice has something to present to you guys, and then you guys are free to go for the day. It's a beautiful day out there, so you guys can go and enjoy the sun. So, but you guys can get